Chapter 2 Guilty. Lamare Amark. The world is ruled by McQuinn Storm Aaron, the Emperor, who was once my lover. His power cuts across the Dominion, and the citizens all bow to honor him. And my son Kino is as he always is, never a citizen of Akea, land of extraordinary powers. I wrote the last paragraph in my scroll, listening to the tip of the quill scratch against the brittle brown paper. The uneasiness in the pit of my stomach grew. I dipped the tip of the feather in black ink and signed my name at the bottom. The door to the small bedroom I occupied opened, and Kino's face peered through the gap. "Mother?" he said sheepishly. "Is this a good time? I'm still angry at you." Kino entered the room limping and pulled the wooden chair close to where I was sitting. He collapsed onto it as though he had something momentous to tell me. But he sat quietly and stared at my scroll. I frowned at him. "I'm sorry, Mother," he said. His eyes were glassy, telling me he meant the apology. He had bruises on his arms and legs and now limps when he walks. These were the result of his most recent exploit with his friend Mayo. "When will you listen to me, Kino? I told you to stop trying to fly. Wings are for birds. Feet are for Akeans. You will soon learn that having a special ability may not be so important," I said without looking at him. "You don't understand," he said. "I'm the only one in Akea with no special ability. I want to fit in. Not all powers are great. Some Akeans possess horrid powers, and if ever you were the one blessed with such a wretched power, you wouldn't be so envious," I told him, although I knew that my speech would not mean much to him. I didn't know how to make him see that being powerless might not be such a bad thing. "Didn't I tell you that sometimes your brain would be more than enough?" I looked at him. Kino's eyes were still moist, and at his very young age, he probably had very little understanding of what I was trying to tell him. To him, being powerless was an unfair disadvantage. If only he knew better. "I want to read what you're writing," he said, changing the subject. I sighed and controlled myself from giving him another lecture. Perhaps the bruises would give him the lessons he so badly needed about obedience. "This isn't for your eyes, Kino," I said. "Especially since you didn't listen to me about not flying." He met my gaze and opened his mouth, and the wide gap between his upper front teeth showed. "I'm sorry, Mother. I really am. I promise I won't fly anymore. Please don't keep your stories from me. I always want to read what you're writing." "Not this one. This is only for the Emperor to see." I was still mad at Kino for his disobedience, but could I blame him for wanting to be named a citizen of Akea? I met his stare, and when he grinned, my anger was replaced with a warm surge of affection and pity towards my son. I wish he had power too. The gods know I wish he had one too. I pulled him closer and let him see what I was writing, but not all of it. The scroll in front of me narrated another series of events in the coming fortnight for Akea, where I, the royal scribe, wove the Dominion's future. And now, I am preparing to submit my latest manuscript. "Why do you always write for him?" "Because it's what I'm good at. It is my gift." Kino frowned. "But I want you to write other stories, not just palace events. I want the ones about the invisible people that you told me about." "Maybe some other time, dear." "But you promised," he insisted. I pulled my son closer towards me and hugged him tightly. My chin rested on top of his head. Kino had grown taller over the past moon turn. He is now 12. I still have a few inches on him, but after another moon turn or two, he would likely grow even taller. "Come, let's go outside," I said. I grabbed the scroll that I would bring to the Canellan Palace later before taking Kino's hand. "I'll tell you another story instead." Kino was grinning sheepishly as he walked beside me. Outside, the two moons, Luna and Risa, greeted us. Akeans believe that the moons brought balance to the land and helped us harness our powers. Sisis, the sun, was beginning to show itself behind a lump of thick cottony clouds. I sat on a patch of green grass in the front yard, and Kino settled beside me. As we usually do, I let him lay his head on my lap. Once upon a time, there was a place in Akea called Nivedon. The people of the land had the power of invisibility, and they roamed the forests without being seen, I started. Nivedon is a real place in Akea, but the stories I told my son about the people were all make-believe. I stopped as Kino's face twisted in an attempt to keep himself from grinning. "What's so funny?" You always start your stories with once upon a time, he said. Because that's how long ago the stories were, I argued. But there could be a lot more for you to say, he said. I played with his brown hair, crumpling ringlets of them in the palm of my hands. You can be so nosy. Do you know that? Kino grinned. He was impossible to get mad at, especially when he smiled at me this way. Shaking my head, I continued with my story about Niveden, its people, and its adventures. Although my son now believes these adventures to be far-fetched, they were a little less strange than what I had experienced in over 3 decades of living in Akea. I started my stories, and tales of Nivens flowed almost mechanically, and yet inside my head, I remembered my own story vividly. The story that led to binding Kino's power. I paused and tried to blink back the pooling tears. It happens every time I remember that I was the cause of my son's unhappiness. The tumultuous Akea that we know now was once a peaceful land, but over many moon turns, things have changed, and the land's history took a turn. It started with a grape picker's son. A man and a dreamer. His name was McQuinn Storm Aaron. Everything is still clear inside my head, no matter how long ago it had been. My father, Nortsum Mendel Amark, was the former emperor. His power was charisma, and because of this, he won the people's hearts. According to my father's loyal supporters, the empire flourished while he was the ruler. Captured by his hubris, my father came to believe that he had everything under control. Sadly, my father was not without his faults. Bring him in, the emperor said. The man who was standing beside him nodded slightly and, in a booming voice, announced, "The emperor wishes to speak to McQuinn Storm Aaron, a grape picker's son and a storm crafter." About a dozen soldiers moved forward, and when they were about 3 yards away from Nortsum, they parted in the middle, revealing a tall young man standing before the emperor. I was sitting beside my father as my gaze fell upon a man whose hair was the color of the storm clouds. His narrow, slanted eyes cast an unsettling gaze that faintly terrified me, but despite this confronting feature, he was otherwise ruggedly handsome. I could tell that more than a few moon turns separated us, just by looking at the hardness that was sculpted in his face, as though he had seen battles and worn the scars that branded him a warrior. The man prostrated himself in front of us. "Your Grace, I am humbled to be afforded this audience," he said in a low voice. Nortsum moved forward in his seat. "Rise, child," he said. McQuinn Storm or Wind, as he was called before, rose, but his head remained bowed, and he did not dare to raise his eyes towards us. Nortsum was pleased that Wind knew the protocol. No one was to meet the emperor's eyes unless expressly given permission. "Open your mouth only when you know the traditions," the emperor's advisor said. Wind still had his head bowed. He put his hands on his chest, right hand over the left, and began to speak. "Highest, I am here to submit myself to your eternal rule. To serve the land. To use my power only for Akea's greatness. And on this premise, to nominate myself as a worthy candidate for the princess's hand in marriage." My heart thumped inside my chest. At 16 moon turns, I was already of marrying age, and my father had made an announcement throughout the land that he was seeking a son consort. Over the past months, men had come from all over the empire and presented themselves to my father and me. What makes McQuinn Storm Aaron believe himself worthy? A man is not fully a man without being of service to a woman. My heart, although still innocent from the love of a woman, offers itself to the princess. "And what of your power?" the emperor asked. "With deep regret, I shall offer my power only to the emperor and to the land. My power is not mine, and I will not surrender it even to a princess most worthy." Father's eyes lit up. Wind knew his words, and by far, he seemed to know how to win my father's approving nod. Father stood up and held out his hand to me. I was confused but did as I was instructed to do. "Come, my child," he told me. I stood up and walked beside my father. "McQuinn Storm Aaron, raise your eyes and meet mine. For now, I shall present you to my daughter." The palace's receiving area came to a standstill, and no nobleman dared to react. Everybody watched curiously. This was the first time that an heir to the throne was a woman, and because of that, the ceremony was unfamiliar to many. For hundreds of moon turns, the heir had always been a man, and as was a man's right, he had always claimed a lady in marriage. But this time around, a man was sought for me. Wind slowly raised his eyes. They were solemn and gray. When his eyes met my father's, there was a trace of deference. But when he looked my way, there was a slight change in his eyes. Even though I was still young and knew nothing about empires and how to rule the land, I believed I saw in Win's eyes a claim over me. A vow that he would make me his. A chill ran down my spine, and I clutched my father's hand tighter. "Father," I gasped. Father smiled at me and touched my face before saying, "Fear not, my joy. He is only a man." My lips were still trembling when my gaze fell upon Wind. This time, he had his eyes back to the floor, waiting for the next part of the ceremony that would make him my betrothed. When the ceremony was over, I rushed up to my room, thinking about what the events would mean to me. Was I ready for this? Was that young man the one I must marry? Was I even of the right age? I mean, I had seen more than 10 turnings of the moon, but was I ready to formally assume being second in line to the throne? My heart thudded inside my chest, and there was a numbing sensation all over my body as though breathing itself was a chore. I felt my cheeks heating up. I was a mix of emotions, yet I knew no one could respond to my queries except my father. I rushed outside my bedroom even though my head had suddenly started throbbing. My knees grew weak, yet I found the will to look for father. I needed to know what the events earlier meant. To me. To the land. And to all Akeans. I found father inside his chamber, drinking his favorite wine. "Ah, my dear princess wants a word with me," he said. I could sense that he was tipsy. "Father, why did you immediately give Sir Aaron your blessing?" I asked. Father sat on his resting chair, gilded with diamonds and rubies. "He is a good man." My eyes widened. "But you don't even know him," I protested. He laughed. "What makes you think that I, the Emperor, don't know him?" He sipped on his goblet. He peered curiously at me over the rim. "Sir Aaron only came to you now to claim my hand, and already you affirmed." He nodded. "I see. There are things that maybe you should know by now," he paused, considering. "You are of age. One day, you will rule Akea. It's time I tell you about the world." I listened with hesitation, confused with my father's drunken words. An emperor doesn't make a decision on impulse. Except maybe in war. But everything is carefully considered. Even before I announced across the land, I had the profiles of citizens examined. Sir Aaron was a good contender, although I didn't know he would want to claim a place in the palace. I saw him rise. He worked in service to the land for a long time, and his power, it will bring Akea to even greater heights. I listened to my father silently. "Will you pour me more wine, child?" I stood up and took the cask of wine. Then I carefully refilled his goblet. "My power is passive. Charm. Who would ever think that it's good enough for an emperor? Perhaps it would be a better power for a war general to rouse the soldiers to fight. But to rule an empire? I feel my power is lacking. Sometimes, I think that it falls short. You won't understand it because your power is magnificent. Win's was like your great-grandfather's, and if history tells us the truth, when my time passes and the rule transfers to you and your betrothed, Akea will attain its zenith once more." "I don't understand," I said. Northsome shook his head. "I know what's best for you, my princess." He looked at me with kind eyes, and I knew he would not tell me anything more. After a long pause, he said, "If you were the dutiful princess I believed you to be, what would you do if your emperor asked you of this, a duty most noble in the service of Akea?" I choked. Not answering the question in the way proprieties dictated would render me rude. Even the princess was not exempt from showing humility before the emperor, regardless of whether he was my father. "Father," I whispered. The emperor nodded, satisfied with my answer. He did not utter another word as I kissed his hand before leaving the room. "Mother?" Kino asked. I realized that he was already sitting beside me and was looking at me with great concern. "What's on your mind, Mother? You didn't even finish the story this time," he complained. I smiled at him to comfort him. "I have many things to think about, dearest," I said. "I know that." A carriage pulled up in front of our cabin. It was carved with a flag of Canela on the side. The leather strappings that extended towards the 2 horses that drew it looked recently replaced. "I should leave now," I said. "The Emperor is waiting for me." "Can I go with you?" Kino asked. "Not today," I said, surprised. I had no intention of having my son set foot in the palace. It would be too painful for me to see him treated by the soldiers and servants as though he was nobody. He should have been the heir to the empire, and it twists my heart to know that he will never be able to lay claim over the land. But maybe someday? He pushed away. I smiled meekly. Of course. Someday's a good day. I kissed him on the top of his head before I stood up. It took me only a few minutes to grab the scroll and walk towards the waiting carriage. I would meet with my former husband later in the day, and I found no excitement in that.